So good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Wherever you may be based in the world, a very warm welcome to you. We're really grateful for you taking the time to join us today on this webinar, where we launch the INEE guidance note on teacher wellbeing in emergency settings. Just a little bit of housekeeping before we get into things. Next slide, please, Benta. As many of you are familiar with, we're using a webinar setting today, so participants' audio and video have been disabled. However, we'd love for you to participate through the Q&A function or through the chat function. Ideally, if you have questions, put them in the Q&A. If you want to communicate to fellow participants or make some comments or introduce yourself, please use the chat. I imagine that we are joined by lots of teachers or former teachers on this call. So if you are a teacher or you used to teach or you're training to be a teacher, let us know in the chat as well, because we'd love to hear from you. As you've noticed, this session is being recorded. We will share the recording on the INEE site after the webinar. We also have closed captioning, live closed captioning available in English. You should be able to see the CC icon at the bottom of your Zoom window, so you can enable that. And as mentioned previously, the recording and presentations will be made available afterwards on the INEE site. So our agenda today, after this welcome and introductions, we will be hearing a scene setting of teacher wellbeing globally, and you'll be hearing from Dr. Nikit Desar. Then we will hear from some of the core team who've been involved in developing the guidance note and the whole Teacher Wellbeing Toolkit. So you'll be hearing from that team next, and then from our team of consultants about the development of the guidance note itself and looking at the content. And then finally, we will have a panel discussion at the end. If you have questions for any of our presenters, please put them in the Q&A, as mentioned before. And just if you indicate who the question is for, or maybe put in brackets all if it's addressed to the whole panel. So as mentioned before, we will be hearing from Dr. Nikit Desar, who is from the Global Centre for Development of the Whole Child. Then we will pass to Amy Parker and Julia Finder-Jonah, who are respectively the co-chairs or former co-chairs of the TIC Collaborative and the PSS SEL Collaborative, and then across to the team of consultants who developed the Teacher Wellbeing Guidance Note, Samaya Mansour, Sophia D'Angelo, Jwalan Patel and Raksha Soor. And then finally, for our panel discussion, we will also be joined by Abla Asif, who has been contextualizing part of the guidance note for the context of Palestine, and that discussion is going to be moderated by Chris Henderson. So that is it from me. I will now stop sharing my screen and pass the mic to Nikit. Thanks, Nikit.
Thanks, Rachel. Just a thumbs up if you can hear me, just clarifying. Perfect. All right, well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. As we gather today to talk about teacher well-being, I just wanted to start by remembering Irma Garcia and Eva Mireles. They were the two fourth grade teachers who were murdered along with 19 of their students in the school shooting in Uvalde, Texas on May 24th. Ms. Garcia had been a teacher at Robb Elementary for 23 years, while Ms. Mireles had been an educator for 17 years. Their stories are known because of the media attention to the shooting in Uvalde. But like Ms. Garcia and Ms. Mireles, there are countless unnamed teachers around the world who work in emergencies to not only educate their students, but also to protect them and support them flourish. They help their children before a crisis to understand how to deal with problems. They help their children during a crisis to return to education and deal with stressors. And they work with their children after a crisis to learn and gain new skills. Today, we focus on the well-being of these teachers. How do these teachers feel and function in their job? This includes their affections, their attitudes, their evaluations of their work. So as Rachel mentioned, I was asked to set the scene, to provide some context of where we have come from and where we are going with teacher well-being. And I think the best way for me to do that is to reflect on my own journey with this concept of teacher well-being. I'm a developmental psychologist. I have worked with children and adolescents in crisis and conflict-affected contexts to understand how to best support their learning and development. My focus has been on children and their outcomes, but in this light, most of the programs and initiatives that I have worked on or was aware of in the pre-pandemic era focused on what we might consider the structural or objective components of teacher well-being. In emergency and low resource contexts, the focus was often on teacher attendance, teacher pay, compensation, and how these were related to children's learning. So for example, an often cited study from economists from MIT and Harvard looked at how monitoring and financial compensation for teachers in India could increase teacher attendance, which would inevitably improve student outcomes. Now, this is not to say that all efforts were focused just on these objective factors. There were other efforts like the Teacher Motivation Working Group that focused on a variety of objective and subjective factors and how they affected a teacher's self-efficacy and their motivation. Similarly, colleagues from Teachers College at Columbia University developed, piloted, field-tested training and coaching packs for primary school teachers in Kakuma refugee camp. And this initiative called Teachers for Teachers is reflected in and influenced the broader work taken up by INEE's Teachers in Crisis Context Collaborative as they developed the training pack and the peer coaching modules. I followed all of these different initiatives and studies with interest because I was working on social emotional programs for children and the research around those programs. We understood that in order to address the social and emotional development of children, we needed to ensure that teachers were doing well and that they could model the social and emotional skills for children. And so we were working directly with teachers to address their well-being. But similar to the issues that we were facing in defining social and emotional skills, right? What are social emotional skills? What are we focusing on? How do we actually define them? There was a lack of framing around what constituted teacher well-being and how the different initiatives and approaches fit within this frame. The landscape review that was commissioned by the Education Equity Research Initiative helped address this. That landscape review provided a comprehensive, big picture framing for what we mean by teacher well-being in low resource and crisis contexts. And then the pandemic hit in early 2020. This changed our discourse around teacher well-being. Teacher well-being received focus as an outcome in itself. While we still understand its importance for children's learning and development, the pandemic has allowed us the opportunity to focus on the needs of teachers, given the levels of stress and disruption that they have experienced in their lives and their careers across the world. This refocus is witnessed in the number of new resources around teacher well-being that were developed during the pandemic. If we look at the INEE teacher well-being gap analysis, they identify that almost 50% of the resources that they mapped were developed during or focused on teachers' needs due to the COVID-19 pandemic. The focus on teacher well-being as an outcome to itself is important. It gives precedence to teachers as individuals within the education system who experience their own stress, their own adversity, rather than taking a narrow focus of addressing specific skills that we hope to improve in children. We can focus on teachers as dynamic, relational, growing professionals who affect and are affected by factors in multiple settings around them. This can improve our work with teachers and support improvements within the education system as a whole. So we're at an important juncture. The discourse around teacher well-being is shifting. There is more of a focus on teacher well-being as an aim to itself. The landscape review, as well as the gap analysis and the guidance note that we will hear more about today, provide us with a very robust blueprint for how we need to move forward to address teacher well-being in emergencies. There is a collection of resources, recommendations, and clear steps we need to be considering. Yet, teacher well-being can feel big. It can feel all-encompassing. We need to think about risk and protective factors at the level of the individual teacher, at the level of the school, the community, the district, the nation, the globe, and how all of these affect the individual teacher and their own self-efficacy, their level of stress, their burnout, their job satisfaction, their motivation, their skills. All of this can be overwhelming. But when faced with this, I hope that our approach shifts to letting teachers decide what is most meaningful to them in their lived experience. Rather than policymakers, donors, or even academics making decisions on what we should focus on, we should incorporate teachers into the decisions at different levels. This point has been raised in the landscape review, in the gap analysis, in the guidance note, and I hope that it becomes our North Star as we define programs and practices that are meant to address the well-being for teachers in emergencies. And so with that, I will hand it over to my colleagues, Julia Findajona and Amy Parker, to discuss the conceptualization of the Teacher Wellbeing Toolkit.
Thank you very much, Dr. Desai, for that. Just such a wonderful way to kick off this webinar today and this discussion around teacher well-being and just how important it is. So thank you for sharing all of that. Rachel, I don't know if we want to announce who all the presenters are before we dive into doing some history about INEE's work on teacher well-being.
Sure, we just went through the slide prior to this, but we can go again if you want. Bente, do you want to bring up that slide?
We can also just move right into talking about the history. Bente, I don't know if you're able to share the slides.
I'm actually sharing slides. It's something has happened to my screen. I'm so sorry. Share again.
Don't worry.
So, can you see my screen now?
There we go. Yeah. Could you just go back to one slide before this?
This one?
Yes, that would be great. Thank you.
There we are.
Okay. Thank you so much. And I want to start by just kind of linking a little bit of the history of INEE's work on teacher well-being to something that Nick mentioned for us all, which is that, you know, due to COVID-19 and the pandemic, there has been this kind of increased focus on teacher well-being. But I think it is very important for all of us to recognize that INEE actually has been raising the flag and talking about teacher well-being for quite a while, and really has had this longstanding commitment to working with teachers in very difficult conflict and crisis affected contexts, and really making sure that we're addressing their well-being needs in those contexts. Similarly, INEE has also had a commitment to advancing policy, practice, and research on psychosocial support and social emotional learning in these contexts. And so just for those of you who may not be familiar, the Teachers in Crisis Context Collaborative, or the TIC, as it is most commonly known, was actually founded in 2014, when there was this acknowledgement at the interagency level, right, that we need to be doing more to provide better support to teachers in crisis settings. And so TIC members started working together to identify problem areas in teacher management, development, and support. And then we're able to propose and provide different interagency open source solutions to address some of these challenges. Throughout TIC's existence, it has supported the development of several key resources for teachers in crisis settings, such as the TIC Primary Teacher Training Pack, then the peer coaching pack for teachers, and both of these global goods that have been used and contextualized for a variety of contexts include modules and content dedicated to teacher well-being. And they really reflect how critical it is to address teachers' well-being needs if we want them to be successful. Similarly, the Psychosocial Support and Social Emotional Learning Collaborative was founded in 2018, but this really was a continuation of the PSS-SEL working group that existed before. And teachers and their mental health and well-being has always been an area of focus for the PSS-SEL collaborative. And several key resources that have been produced include references to teacher well-being, such as the background paper on PSS and SEL for children and youth in emergency settings, the guidance note on psychosocial support, and the PSS-SEL training. So given this common interest in teacher well-being, in early 2020, the TIC and PSS-SEL collaboratives decided to join forces on a joint project to develop a teacher well-being toolkit for the sector. Next slide, please. But I'm not sure if you're able to go to the next slide.
I'm actually very, very sorry. I think, Rachel, you have to take over. Something has happened to my computer.
Don't worry, that's fine. So I can just start by saying a little bit about how this came to be. And so we've been lucky to have the support from Education Cannot Wait, which has really enabled the PSS and SEL and TIC collaboratives to come together to advance our understanding of teacher well-being in these low resource, crisis, and conflict-affected contexts that really builds off of the work done to date. Some of which I just mentioned and with which Nick had mentioned as he was speaking. And so the goal of our toolkit is really to identify existing and create new practical guidance and tools that support teacher well-being. With the most important point being, we want to do this by placing teachers at the center of this work. And I think that also links nicely to what Nick had said about the importance of teachers' voices, right? And hearing from them about how we support their well-being. And so we really hope that this toolkit will strengthen political support for teachers and their well-being and increase the ability of many different stakeholders, including teachers themselves, to take meaningful action to provide this type of support. And you can see here the contents of the toolkit include a mapping of teacher well-being resources and gap analysis, the guidance note, which we'll be talking about more today, and then contextualized teacher well-being resources that are in the process of being developed. With that, I will hand it over to Amy Parker, who is the former co-chair of the TIC Collaborative.
Thank you, and I'm going to be super quick before handing it over to the main event. Just one final note in terms of the fact that the guidance note is formulated around the minimum standards, which, as I'm sure most people on the call are aware of, is the seminal guidance document on which INEE is built. So it does make for hopefully a very practical way of operationalizing the standards. I'm going to leave it there because my colleagues have mentioned everything else that's important so far. So I'm going to hand over now to the key presenters. Over to you, Sophia and Karen. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Amy and Julia, and thank you, Nick, for doing a great scene setting there at the beginning. So I have 3 or 4 minutes to go over kind of the work that led into the guidance note. Well, we're going to begin with that. I worked. This first part is on the mapping that has just been shared in the chat, I think, by Rachel. So please, I invite you also to take a look, but I will give you a broad overview real quickly. Next slide, please. So I think one of the important things to note is that we're going to talk about 2 pieces of work in particular, the mapping and the guidance note, but that this, as has been mentioned by the previous presenters, is building on a lot of previous work led by the TIC and PSS-SEL collaborative. And in particular, next slide, I wanted to call out this landscape review to teacher well-being in low resources, crisis, and conflict-affected settings, which I think did a lot of the groundwork for this subsequent research and mapping and guidance note. In particular, next slide, it sets a framework, a conceptual framework using a socio-ecological model that really, I think, does an excellent job at highlighting sort of the complexity of teacher well-being. And it kind of touches on a lot of the points that we've made previously here about the importance of contextualization, localization, and really focusing on the teacher and the teacher-centered a teacher-centered approach, right? So it's looking at the individual level, how gender, displacement status, level of education, employment, teaching experience, content knowledge, etc., all shape teachers, the challenges that teachers face, and also the coping mechanisms they use to address those challenges. Within a school, community, national, regional, and global context, there's also, of course, the policy environment that plays a role, social relationships, peer relationships, but also student-teacher relationships, school leadership, and as well as access to basic needs of the community, right? So all these things, if you can't put food on the table, that's going to affect how you go to work the next day and how you cope with the challenges that you face at work. So that said, next slide. We used this for the mapping activity. We used this framework to really look at what the resources we collected were addressing. A bit on the approach, we only collected open access materials, which means materials that are publicly available and free, no cost. And we looked for them in all 5 of the INEE core languages. We also collected, there were some that were other languages as well as indigenous languages, etc. Again, I invite you to look at the link in the chat, specifically the Excel sheet, which is a downloadable resource that gives you access to all of these resources in PDF or web link forms. In addition, again, using this kind of teacher-centered approach, we wanted to reach out to our networks to do a bit of targeted search to collect resources that they may use that may not be publicly available, and we've gotten their permission to share these with you as well. There was also a teacher survey, which we collected with, I think there's over 1,000 responses. It was one of the largest INEE surveys, actually. And it was to understand, again, what their coping mechanisms are, what they saw as the key challenges. At that time, COVID-19 related challenges were getting most prominence or most response. But there was also, of course, the financial aspect as well, and the need for more pedagogical support. I think a little disclaimer here is that we focus on 3 types of resources, or 3 types of materials, what we called resources, measurement tools, and policy advocacy papers. The resources were very action-oriented, right? So they included any materials that either people working with teachers or teachers themselves could use to practice coping mechanisms. Maybe it was, mental health exercises, stress burnout exercises, etc. There were measurement tools, which could be quantitative or qualitative tools used to measure teacher well-being and assess teacher well-being. And then the policy advocacy papers, which kind of discussed broader issues and kind of legal frameworks or kind of political aspects of teacher well-being. So the disclaimer with all that is that we did not, and next slide, we did not collect the pedagogical resources. And I think this is kind of something that really shaped our findings. Of course, we know that teaching and learning in itself is a huge challenge. But what we wanted to do is really focus. There are so many open educational resources that support with pedagogy, and I would love that to be maybe a next step eventually. But for now, we focused really specifically on this kind of mental health, psychosocial support, as well as physical health. There were a couple of resources that looked at physical health, especially in the context of remote learning and remote teaching, sitting at your desk, making sure you have time to move your body, to stretch, etc. Next slide. So also we looked at the intersection of teacher well-being and emergency settings, right? I think one important point, as has been made, is this was conducted during COVID-19. So technically all countries that had been hit by COVID-19 at that time are going through an emergency setting, and we know that that's affected teachers and teachers' well-being globally. And on the bright side, as Nick had said in the beginning, is it kind of pushed forward this agenda and kind of sparked an interest in teacher well-being. And 52% of the resources that we collected came from North America or Europe in what would otherwise be considered stable context outside of COVID-19. what we also realized, the downside to that is that they were rarely targeting a particular country or region, that these resources were rarely focusing in on that kind of national contextual needs, let alone subnational contextual needs. And I think also Nick had mentioned at the beginning in terms of this, the school shooting in Uvalde, Texas, we're seeing that the diversity of attacks on schools, whether it's in Afghanistan, Northeast Nigeria, or Sahel, whether it's political, ideological, or just senseless gun violence in the USA, the idea of emergency and the idea of teacher well-being is very broad and very complex and requires this contextualization. I'll never forget an interview with one of our key informants who said, don't tell me to breathe in a war zone, right? There are certain strategies and that just don't resonate or don't consider the contextual needs and the kind of realities that teachers face and the challenges that teachers face, right? There's going to be other priorities. I'm not going to have time to sit and do yoga or meditation always. So it's not only adapting the strategies, but also the language that we use. And it's interesting because just today I was reading a blog on US teachers' well-being, and it was a similar comment made saying, when my school leaders sent me self-help tools and yoga videos, it actually made me more angry rather than relaxed, right? Again, and this is the need to center teachers' voices, to involve them in this process, and to really understand how to best support them. So next slide, please. Samaya will now go over the 13 recommendations of the teacher wellbeing materials mapping. Samaya, over to you.
Thank you, Sophia, and hello, everybody. I'll be walking you through the recommendations that came out of the resource mapping exercise we did and the research. So the research resulted in 10 findings related to the design and the content of teacher well-being materials and resources, which are all detailed in the gap analysis Julia just shared in the chat box. And the findings revealed several challenges and opportunities for the creation and dissemination of existing and new materials. So we included 13 recommendations for practitioners, policymakers, and other stakeholders working to support teachers in emergency settings. One key recommendation is to focus on teacher well-being as an outcome unto itself, because it's been commonly considered as an instrumental step in supporting student well-being. And we found that the needs of teachers varied across different emergency settings, which is why materials should be adapted to respond to these settings and to optimize their relevance, impact, and effectiveness. The mapping also showed that existing materials that support teacher well-being have not been validated. Therefore, there is a need to collect evidence on the impact of existing teacher well-being efforts and programs. And given that the materials are created in stable environments in the global north, as Sophia just mentioned, we found that it's very critical to adapt and create adaptation guides that support the contextualization of those materials to account for sociolinguistic and cultural dynamics. And linking to this point, we found that there's a lack of linguistic inclusion in the range of materials collected. Most of the materials we collected were in the English language. So there's a need to translate existing quality materials to other languages so that teachers can have easy and quick access, especially those working in emergency settings. Another key recommendation is to ensure that efforts to teacher well-being are inclusive, gender responsive, and they address the unique characteristics of individual teachers. And as Sophia just mentioned, there's a need to fully engage teachers by giving them agency and voice throughout the process of development of the resources and materials. And the exclusion of teachers in the development was also found in the policy conversations around teacher well-being, right? So teachers face several challenges at the policy level, including poor compensation, heavy workloads, and irrelevant professional development opportunities. So stakeholders should provide clear pathways for teachers to advocate for change at the policy level. One of the key challenges we found from our survey was the irregular and poor compensation. So there's a need to improve compensation so that teachers are paid consistently and regularly, and to also create materials that respond to teachers' compensation needs beyond just pay, right? So we need to look at ways to support teachers through, say, housing, health insurance, and other benefits. And that could be facilitated through the collection and tracking of data on teacher pay, which plays a key role in reducing the related negative impacts on teacher well-being. And efforts on teacher well-being should not put extra burden on them, so we recommend the use of whole school and whole community approaches to facilitate the participation and buy-in of teachers, and to engage school leadership in safeguarding the impact and sustainability of teacher well-being efforts at the level of the school and the community. And lastly, teacher well-being efforts and materials have to include pedagogical and informal teacher well-being strategies that are linked to instruction and professional development. And with that, I'll hand it over to our colleagues to talk about the guidance note.
Hello everyone. For some reason my camera doesn't start off, isn't starting up, but there we go. I'm just going to get us started. First and foremost, thank you for joining us today, and thank you to INEE for engaging us in the process. Samaya, Sophia, Raksha and I have been a part of writing the guidance note, and then other INEE members were collaboratively a part of that process as well. So in the next 3-4 minutes, I just want to briefly talk through what are we presenting in the guidance note, and then Raksha will take over to walk through a couple of samples. Bente, could you take us to the next slide, please? Thank you. As we have heard several times today, some of the things that we were very mindful of was that teacher well-being, there is very poor teacher well-being, and generally it's because of several systemic issues, and that onus shouldn't necessarily be transferred to the teacher to resolve their own well-being. There's systemic issues that need to be resolved. We were mindful that we wanted to pursue teacher well-being for its own sake, as a goal unto its own self, rather than as an instrumental purpose. And broadly, we wanted to help develop a practical, actionable guidance note that compiled actionable theory, evidence, clear next steps, and best practices to inform various stakeholders involved in education and emergencies. Sophia did speak through our methodology, but I'm going to recap it very briefly. We were building on the INEE mapping study. We conducted an in-depth literature review. Thereafter, we ran workshops with various stakeholders across various organizations, which included policymakers, school leaders, teachers, and other experts that were experiencing various short-term and protracted emergencies in diverse contexts. These workshops and the various the literature review and the surveys then informed a couple of efforts to gather exemplary policies, programs, and tools through surveys once again. And then we followed up with a few follow-up discussions and interviews. Finally, we engaged in a more collaborative writing in consultation with various other INEE team members and stakeholders. So the guidance note is broadly structured around 3 principles, which we saw as key to teacher well-being. The first one is centered around access to mental health and psychosocial support for teachers. And broadly, this talks about notions of ensuring there is access to basic services and security where teachers get basic needs. There is community support for teachers. There's access to focused but non-specialized support, including mindfulness, stress management, and then more specialized support, including specialized care and counseling. The second principle focuses on creating an enabling work environment where there is a safe environment, where teachers have enough resources, there's equitable teacher pay, there are opportunities for career and professional development. And finally, the third principle, which emerged a lot more from the various consultation workshops, was focused around teacher voice, agency, and leadership. Teachers need to be thought of as experts and professionals in their domains. They need to be given enough autonomy on their curricula, pedagogy. Their voice and their involvement is a must in policy making and decision making. And there need to be opportunities for formal and informal leadership both. And as we started off with this, we used 2 steps. We wrote 2 different drafts. The first one was a lot more theoretical one, just exploring these principles. And thereafter, we redrafted it, mapping it onto the INEE minimum standards, making it far more accessible and easy to use and applicable. I'm going to hand over to Raksha soon, but before I do that, I just want to recap or bring our attention to the socio-ecological model that Sophia had referred to earlier. We see teachers as embedded within local context, within national context, and within larger global context. And the guidance note keeps that in mind, ensures that we are covering actionable steps and strategies for all of the stakeholders. With that said, Raksha, over to you.
Thanks, Jalan. Next slide, please. Yes, thanks, Rachel. So to help operationalize the guidance note, all of the strategies and the recommendations for teacher well-being are mapped against the INEE minimum standards, as we've said. And if you turn to page 23 and 24 of the guidance note, what you'll see is a table which provides a high-level summary of the teacher well-being strategies against those minimum standards, as well as the 3 pillars. So for example, in this image, what this shows us is what's associated to domain 3, teaching and learning. In the leftmost column, you can see the 4 standards. You'll also see the use of acronyms. For example, D3S1 here means domain 3 standard 1. And on the right side of the table, you'll see a summary of those teacher well-being strategies associated to the standards as well as to those 3 pillars. Now, the acronyms are hyperlinked, so you can easily move to the strategies and recommendations that you are most interested in. Next slide, please. So once we've moved now, right, into a particular standard and the related recommendations, we're going to come across a couple of sections. And these sections are organized the same way across all of the standards. It begins with a brief introduction to what the standard is, how the standard can promote teacher well-being, and some of those core barriers to consider for teacher well-being that's associated to that particular standard. We're then going to move into the specific recommendations for teacher well-being associated again to those standards. And here, as you'll see, they're color-coded. The recommendations are organized by pillars. Some of the recommendations now are cut across multiple standards. And so there are hyperlinks that will take you to other places in the document where that particular recommendation is explained in much more detail. Following those recommendations, there are some supportive resources that you can use to help operationalize the recommendations, such as guidelines and tools. And finally, each standard ends with what is called spotlight examples. So again, these are examples of programs or tools that can serve as inspiration for conducting teacher well-being work. And many of these programs and tools were submitted to us by organizations, agencies, and others during the consultation process. Next slide, please. And just a quick note here that as you move through the guidance note and what we've been hearing from the other presenters too, is to please note that the strategies and recommendations are really meant to provoke thought and reflection rather than to just be prescriptive. And so for that reason, we very much strongly suggest that you adapt these strategies and recommendations to your own unique context. We have provided some guiding questions to support that contextualization process, and you'll see some of those questions here on that slide, but there are likely to be others that will also further support your work. I'm also excited to share that there are some really great contextualization pieces of work being done currently on the guidance note in Colombia, Kukuma, Myanmar, and Palestine. So that's wonderful to see too. And I'll just end by saying again that this guidance note was co-created by the very generous support of so many. And so just on behalf of the consultant team, we'd like to send our thanks and our gratitude, of course, to the INEE core team, the reference group on teacher well-being, the participants, especially who took time and effort to attend the consultation and share their experiences and expertise, and of course to the many individuals who acted as peer reviewers to provide insight and direction. Thank you, and I'll turn it over now to Rachel.
I'll just turn it straight over to Chris to moderate our panel discussion. Thank you so much to all the presenters.
Yeah, and I just want to share that sentiment, Rachel. Thanks so much to Sophia, Samaya, and Raksha for that overview, not just of the gap analysis and resource mapping, but the guidance note as well, which is very exciting to have out there in the world. My name is Chris Henderson. I'm based at Teachers College, Columbia University, and I'm also the co-chair of the Teachers in Crisis Context Collaborative with INEE. And it's my pleasure today to welcome back Dr. Niket Desar, Abla Asaf, Samaya, Raksha, Joalin, and Sophia for a conversation on what this guidance note means for the development of teacher wellbeing policies and practices globally in emergency contexts, but also what it means in terms of how we contextualize teacher wellbeing across the many emergency contexts that we're engaged in. So first off, I'm actually wanting to go to my colleague Abla, who's based in Palestine and working with the Norwegian Refugee Council. And the key question for you and for all of your experience and all that you have experienced in recent years, I mean, how have you seen this concept of teacher wellbeing develop? And how have you seen different initiatives play out through your work with Norwegian Refugee Council, but in Palestine more generally? So over to you, Abla.
Thank you, Chris. Thanks everyone, thanks Rachel and everyone for this great and huge and fantastic effort on teacher well-being. Yes, this is a field that was really thirsty for such studies and such work. And what's amazing and what's different this time is the effort on putting this into practice. So we've been reading, not a lot, because unfortunately even there isn't that much literature about this. There are not much studies everywhere globally, and specifically if I will talk about Palestine, unfortunately I can say there is very little, the minimum. But with this resource, huge resource, tools and plans, for dissemination, for contextualization, and for even this launch and the huge effort to also raise funds and to open doors for funds for this issue is very important and amazing. Actually, for myself as Education Technical Officer with NRC since 2012 in Palestine, and I will talk about our, let's say, humble efforts here in Palestine, and I will link this with the issues of fundraising, and this was a question. There is an issue on raising funds on teacher projects that end with teacher goals. Most of the fund is going for teachers to support students, which is fantastic, which is a huge needed, specifically in emergencies. But also looking at teachers as an end line and end goal is very important. And this is actually, we lack a lot of this. But since 2012, teachers were in our core. And sometimes I feel like I'm a teacher. Yes, I'm a teacher. And everyone who talks to me says, Abla, you're speaking as a teacher, not like a teacher. I say, yes, I need to be a teacher in order to feel it. And in order to imagine the difficulties, the risks, the concerns, and the challenges you are being through. So since our program started in 2012, we had this in our discussion, teachers, what can we do? Okay, the ministry is asking for capacity building. That's okay. They are also asking for hardware support, so for stationery. Yes, that's okay. But what else? What next we can do? And I will start with this simple example. During our capacity building workshops, which can be traditional and as any regular training, just a training, presentation, some activities, but even we used to play games with teachers, because we know they are coming here for a purpose, not only just to take the information. We're caring that they can enjoy the time they are spending with us, and they are doing something different. And frankly speaking, all the teachers. We ask about our trainings. I'm not talking about teacher well-being yet, but when we ask them about the training, they tell us that you provide things in a different way. You care about, is it enjoyable or not, if we enjoy it or not. And so this is a point that is appreciated. We sometimes draw, we sit on the floor and we play, we use balloons. Look, these are very simple things and activities. We play music, and there is a colleague in the education team who's an artist. We bring him to every single training because yes, this is important. And there starts the point of what can we provide for teachers? And we started with simple initiatives with, let's say, school-based debriefing sessions, sometimes a 2-hour session or even a small party. Then we expanded into central full-day training. Then we expanded into a component, an independent component, which is support the supporters. And this was dedicated for teachers' well-being and self-care. And we do it through partners who are specialized in this. But it is planned, it is designed, it is developed, and it is implemented with our review that we are putting teachers in our minds. We are working for teachers. So yes, we are giving a lot of care. This is not that much big initiative, but it is working and it is doing well. Unfortunately, and even during my contextualization process, this is the only activity that was mentioned on the ministry level. When I asked about, are there any initiatives for teachers, they said, it's only the supporters. It's only in our... Yeah.
Sorry,
yeah.
Can I just interrupt you there? And I want to build on a point and bring Nikit into the conversation. And I'm sorry for interrupting.
Yeah,
I really want to build on this idea of supporting the supporters and that need for us to professionalize or re-professionalize teachers as a core part of their well-being. And so Nikit, in terms of what you've seen over the last 5 years and perhaps what you would like to see in the next 5 years, how do we support the supporters? How do we put teachers at the center and re-professionalize the workforce for their own well-being?
Maybe I think that...
Oh, sorry. Can I just invite Nikit to respond to that one? Thank you.
Sorry. So yeah, thanks for that, Chris. So I think related to what Abla mentioned at the start, a lot of this relates to funding for this work as well. And when I think back to the question that was raised in the chat is how do we kind of advocate for this funding? And I think of this chain link that we always tend to build in the work that we do in emergencies and crisis contexts and in international development in general. I think if we think back maybe 15 years ago, when we started focusing a lot on literacy and numeracy, the argument was let's link it to the fact that children need to be ready at grade 3 to learn other subjects, right? And then as the evidence came from US and high resource contexts about the importance of social emotional learning, the question was, how do we get funding for social emotional learning? And the link that was made was social and emotional learning was important because it affected literacy and numeracy, which then affected kind of broader outcomes for children. And now with teacher well-being, in my experience, the way that we've had to convince people to fund teacher well-being and those initiatives is to make the argument that teacher well-being is related to social emotional learning, right? So we keep like creating these links. But if we look back now to social emotional learning, what I've seen is, at least in social emotional learning, we're now at a place where we don't need to make that argument anymore. I think we're at a point where donors, funders globally, ministries as well, have seen the importance of social emotional learning for children as an outcome in itself. And I believe that's where we're moving with teacher well-being, I hope, because we've been kind of making that link between teacher well-being and social emotional learning. But I think because of the pandemic, where we've now moved is to a point where donors and funders and ministries are interested in teacher well-being for itself. So I think that shift is already being made. I think we as a collective need to push it further, right? And so I think Abla's experience and the kind of the experiences that she's talking about are important in in articulating through these guidance notes. For example, hearing Raksha talk about the contextualization of the guidance note is important because it then allows us to look at what it looks like in Colombia, what it looks like in Myanmar, and make that argument for teacher well-being funding in itself.
Amazing. And you've added the perfect segue, because I was actually about to go to Raksha and ask about contextualization. And I know in your work, Raksha, and in my work, there's often an element of stigma or an element of taboo that is still attached to this idea of teacher mental health, teacher well-being. And I'm wondering if you can comment on, and particularly in terms of developing the guidance note, how we navigate that stigma and how we actually work at this intersection of mental health promotion and teachers' work and well-being.
Yeah, thank you, Chris, so much for that really important question. I think what I'd start by saying is this idea of just acknowledging that this is a problem first and foremost. Just being able to set it on the table means that we also know that this is where we're starting and where we're going. Mental health or mental well-being, broadly psychosocial well-being, is this idea of understanding that many people. In fact, that's probably the heart and core of what mental health or well-being means. And so as part of our process with contextualizing, it means that with our guidance note, we took a very expansive view to understanding what well-being or mental health even meant, whether that includes basic needs for livelihoods through teacher incentives, whether it means teacher professional development, for example, and ensuring teachers feel a sense of confidence and safety in what it is that they're doing, or even in terms of saying things as these are the experiences that teachers are going through that concern their protection, and we have to be able to address this. So, you know, the thought here is to say, number one, yes, it's being stigmatized, but two, the way to address this is to say, let's take an expansive view. Let's ensure that that view is also grounded to how teachers experience mental health and well-being, how they define mental health and well-being, and let's move forward in that process as well. And having those open and transparent discussions with all stakeholders in this education system is key to ensuring that we can address this. Thanks.
Wonderful. And unfortunately, we had a couple of connection issues there, but that last part of your response was really clear and helped us understand this concept a lot. And just because we're short on time, Joylyn, I'm hoping I can come to you for a final, or at least second to last question. And we've theorized and we've talked about the concepts of teacher wellbeing and mental health a lot, particularly in crisis contexts. And I'm wondering if you can just give us a really concrete example, similar to what Abla provided, in terms of how you see this playing out in school context for teachers, like how will they experience this guidance note in action?
So I'm going to take one principle as example. I'm going to use the principle 3, which centers around teacher voice, agency, and leadership. And this is some of the work that I've been involved in for the past 6 years. We have been trying to work in Western India to try and promote support systems for teachers, bottom-up, collaborative, TPD and CPD, teacher professional development models, forefront agency and teacher voice, and get them involved in non-positional leadership forms. So for example, a common practice nowadays is to build COPs, communities of practice, where teachers from various contexts come together, where they have a safe space to share concerns, to contextualize, to look at to make their own autonomous decisions, and to basically come together and build a sense of community of we have shared challenges, and here is how I'm trying to solve these challenges in my classroom and share those best practices. So instead of using a top-down approach to teacher training, where we go in with here are strategies that everyone needs to use, teachers come together sharing that this is what works in my classroom. Maybe it's something that would interest you or another teacher, another peer. So we have been doing this. Now we are trying to work with teachers in getting them to do their own action research studies. We are trying to bring visibility to their best practices and so on and so forth. I'm mindful of the time. If you want me to expand, I can speak for a few more minutes, Chris, unless you want to go to someone else for the last question.
I think you've actually made a really strong point there. And the way I understand that point is so much of what we're already doing, whether it's around teacher professional development, communities of practice, centering teachers' voices and enabling their agency is actually a core component of building teacher wellbeing and mental health also. So yeah, I really appreciate the response you provided there. And I think just as a final question, a big way to wrap up, I suppose, some of the points that have come from the audience, and sorry we haven't touched on the audience questions more specifically, some of the points do come to this idea of pay. You know, Suha, you raised the point in Lebanon that teachers are leaving the classroom in public schools because pay is insufficient, specifically due to the inflation that's experienced there, and they're starting to work for NGOs because the pay is better. I mean, and Nikki, you talked about our need to advocate for better conditions for teachers, to actually look at this link effect. How can we use this guidance note to really speak on behalf of teachers to say that at the core, as well as just these basic conditions of pay, of good environments to work in, for their professionalization? Sophia, anyone, what would be the final point you want to make on how this guidance note contributes?
I heard my name, so I guess I'm going to jump in here. I mean, I think two things that the guidance note points out, and pay has been an issue. I think Nick had set the scene really well at the beginning. Pay has been an issue that caught attention for a while now, right? For many years. I think one thing that the guidance note and the mapping as well points out is that it's not just pay now. It's actually broader than that. It's broader compensation. It's paid time off. It's health insurance. It's food vouchers to ensure that they have basic needs, right? So I think that's one thing that is important to highlight, and that the guidance note and the mapping both highlight. I think also it looks at a multi-sectoral approach, and how different ministries, different government institutions, but different actors within these various levels of the ecosystem play a role in supporting these needs, whether it's setting up wash facilities in communities, or making sure they have a place to get food, etc. But also, again, it's this teacher-centered approach, and it's showing teachers, and there's a part in the guidance where we're looking at teachers' rights and making sure that teachers know their rights. And I think this is also in that way, it's a very humanizing approach, right? We're no longer just saying that teacher well-being is for students' learning and student outcomes. It's teacher well-being is to support teachers as human beings, because they have certain rights and certain liberties that need to be protected and need to be at the forefront of these agendas. So I'll leave it at that. But thanks again, Chris, and thank you to all panelists.
Yeah, and wonderful way to end, and absolutely on point message that all of us can take forward and continue to promote. To all of our panelists, thank you so much for giving up your time for this important issue. To all of our consultants, our partners, thank you so much for your hard work on this issue as well. And to all our audience, of course, thank you for being here today. We can't do this without you. So back to you, Rachel.
Thank you. Oh, Abla.
Just half a minute, sorry, but because during my contextualization process, I administered an online survey, and I shared the link with many teachers. One of the teachers was a friend, and she sent me a WhatsApp message saying that I was happy to fill the survey. I know that it is just for data collection, but this means that there is someone somewhere is caring. And this is great. Yes, thank you. And I'm sorry for this.
Thank you, Abla. A very important final point. Thanks so much to everybody. Just before we go, just a quick slide of what's next. The recording and presentation will be shared on our website. The guidance note is in the process of being translated into Arabic, French, Portuguese, and Spanish, and those should be available at the end of the summer. I'm loath to give an exact date because you know what we're like at INEE, but let's say August, September. And finally, as mentioned by Raksha and Abla, there are 4 teams working on contextualization of the guidance note at the moment, just sections of it, but the processes are very, very interesting and very illuminating, and those will be available very soon during the summer. A final note is that we are now thinking about what's next. Okay, we have this guidance note, but how indeed do we make sure it's taken up and that the recommendations are contextualized and used? So our next step is to develop a kind of capacity building pack so that you can have country level workshops to help introduce the guidance note, but also think about an action plan, maybe led by organisations and at the cluster level. So that's what's coming next. Thank you all so much for being here. Just enormous heartfelt thanks to everybody involved in this effort. It was hugely collaborative, and thanks to reference group members who I spotted in the audience. You are absolutely fantastic. So take good care, everybody. Share this guidance note, take a look through, give us feedback, and we'll see you all very soon. Bye, everyone. Thank you.